All right. I see now we are streaming live. Welcome everybody to our Rev War Revelry. We're doing a special one this weekend. It is the holiday weekend. I hope everybody had a happy Independence Day and enjoyed the festivities, had a safe and happy holiday. You know, in light of our national celebration of American independence, you know, we were very lucky to have here today a good friend of the blog here is Bob Hoar with the Bennington State Battlefield Park up in New York, right on the border with Vermont there. And we're pleased to talk about one of the events that led up to that would, you know, eventually end in the celebration of American independence. And that was a little known event that actually happened 250 years ago this month. So what we're, you know, just like we came to you a few months ago from Alamance down in North Carolina about this kind of intercolonial conflict going on. Now we're traveling north and we're up in New England now. And we're going to be talking about the events going on between New Hampshire and New York that eventually led to the birth of the state of Vermont and some of the most well-known heroes of the Revolutionary War, the Green Mountain Boys. So we're very pleased to have Bob here tonight, and he's going to tell us a bit about the history of what happened 250 years ago this month. And then also give you some things that they got coming up that they're planning to do up there to commemorate this event that's known as the Breakenridge Standoff. So Bob, why don't we just go ahead and first ask, yeah, so what's the tension going on? What's the status going on between New Hampshire and New York at this time in 1771?
Okay, so in 1771, there had been a change in jurisdiction over these grants that were to become Vermont, and that jurisdiction was given to New York, and they acted on that change of just jurisdiction and had some trials in Albany where they found some specific settlers and were attempting to eject them, which was not really to remove them, but to just sort of change their jurisdiction through sort of a taking of their property and then giving it back to them under New York law. So the Vermonters at this time were resisting this and thinking that the king would make a final ruling on their behalf. And they were holding out for this. There was petitions. The leader of Bennington had gone to London all about this. And they're not realizing that New Hampshire had sort of backed out. So Vermont is sort of acting on their own, expecting help that's not really out there. So in 1771, what we're really talking about is there was a standoff that had to do with those rulings in the court in Albany, and the Vermonters basically defeated their attempts to evict them.
So at this time, did they consider themselves Vermont as their own independent entity, or were they, I guess, how did they view themselves in relation between these New Hampshire grants and, you know, were these granted to be a separate part of New Hampshire, or were these to be their own independent state? I guess, how did they view themselves between the two conflicting areas?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So it's known as the New Hampshire grants. And the New Hampshire settlers, I guess, were expecting to be a part of New Hampshire, okay? And at this time, they had not declared themselves independent. That's not until, I believe it's 76, when they declare themselves to be a separate district. And then Vermont, they declare themselves to be Vermont in 77.
Oh, okay. So at this time, they're thinking that eventually they'll be a part of New Hampshire.
Exactly. Yeah, they're not quite sure, but that's what they're expecting to be, and they think that New Hampshire is going to take right over. And some of the settlers hold New Hampshire titles like, you know, sheriff and those sorts of things.
Oh, really? Okay. And,
yeah.
And from the New York perspective, did they view that they were encroaching on New York land at this time, or did they, or did they want to annex this part to New York? I guess, how did New York view this contested area?
Okay, so I guess I would say that traditionally, I think that both in England and in the colonies, they had at this time generally understood that there was a line running north from the west line of Connecticut to Lake Champlain, and that area was New England. Okay, so the New York claims had to do with the change of jurisdiction under a ruling from the king. And this came in 1764. And I think the key really is in 1763. It's this proclamation of 1763 that really tells us and informs us what's going on here. So that limits white settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. And in our case, that goes right through Vermont. Okay. So in addition to that, it has a lot to do with the Stamp Act. So we're talking about the king trying to collect fees for granting of lands. So while at the same time, New York had sort of gone, overboard with its granting of lands, the king wanted to sort of get in there and control both what New Hampshire had done and what New York had done with the proclamation of 1763 and the ruling in 64 that gave New York jurisdiction over to the Connecticut River. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that the jurisdiction was over there, but it wasn't a complete ruling. So it left the settlers sort of in a legal limbo where they still had titles, but had to reconfirm them with New York.
Okay. And so New York then decides, that they have legal claim over this. And you're saying that, and then how did this end up that this standoff ultimately ends up happening? What's the lead up to this, and who, what is, or who is Breakenridge, and give us a little background on how this armed standoff is eventually going to come into being.
Cool. I think maybe the next thing to talk about would be excuse me there for a second. New York had some legal rulings on their side, but then in 67, there was a ruling by the king that had gone sort of against New York's interests, okay? So Bennington's founder, Samuel Robinson, took a petition and went to London. And he didn't really have an audience with the king, and he ends up dying there, I think of smallpox. But the effect was the same. So the same Privy Council that made the 64 ruling in 67 did sort of a restraining order on the New York governors to stop this granting. So I think what's the interesting part here is that, and little known perhaps for this audience, is that New York had created a whole grid of overlapping claims in a whole different set of towns on top of the already existing New Hampshire grid of towns. And so these were actually contrasting lines. So the New Hampshire grid looks something like a bunch of squares, and the New York grid included a lot of sort of irregular shaped patterns, choicest lands, and lands along riverbeds. So what they were really trying to do within the orders of the proclamation of 1763 was to cut off New England settlement to the west. And what they wanted to do there was to settle Scottish soldiers, retired Scottish soldiers on the border between Vermont and New York. So nominally that's the plan. But what happened was that those grants were basically bought up by the rich assemblymen down in New Hampshire, down in New York City. So that the rich New Yorkers that were sort of behind all this egregious granting and re-granting of Vermont lands then sort of bought up all those grants, almost all of them. Okay, so I guess the fraud was sort of quite prevalent there. So what happens is that perhaps at the trials in Albany, that those trials weren't very fair. They didn't accept the Vermonters' argument. So that the trials had to do with admitting the jurisdiction of New York just by going to the trial. Kind of see what I'm saying there?
Mhm.
And so that, yeah, basically all of the New Hampshire and the New Hampshire settlers' evidence wasn't allowed. So some things happened, like they claimed that the Vermonters were within 17 miles of Hudson River, which isn't really true. This whole story is about the Vermonters and New Hampshire having made a border 20 miles from Hudson River.
Oh, really? Huh.
Right. So somehow, really, I guess I have to get to the point here is that the New York Attorney General and the judges and most of those people were interested in these cases. They held the land that was being re-granted to New York. They had been paid the fees. They're remitting those fees to the king, which is what the king wants. He wants a stream of revenue. They're charging higher rates for this land than New Hampshire had originally charged. So that also means higher fees that will go back to the king. But this land is really being consolidated in the hands of the rich and the powerful. Okay, so Breckenridge is the original guy in 1769 that stood up to all this. So the surveyors got right around the New York-Vermont border, and he stopped the surveyors and said that he would rather spill his heart's blood than to see his land divided. And it's this scenario that sounds like the Vermont leaders and settlers like Breckenridge were negotiating between the New York surveyors and their own people. So the people of Vermont were more radical than the leaders of Bennington, okay? And were sort of having a civil action that the leaders of Bennington and the New York surveyors sort of had to mitigate in the midst of, okay? And the New Yorkers were just as threatening in these situations as the Vermonters. So we don't really have a lot of the rhetoric handed down to us through time that would have been the things that the New Yorkers had said. We have a lot of ideas of what Ethan Allen had said and some of the Vermont threats that are sort of a part of this storyline. But the New Yorkers would have threatened the Vermonters to stop them and to break their chain. And that if they had done that, that's going to change their legal status, which is kind of exactly how they prosecuted the case. So that the Vermonters, or the New Hampshire grant settlers, that is, were treated like individual trespassers, okay? So what they're doing is they're defending the border between New York and Vermont for the initial interests of Benning Wentworth, of creating that line between New Hampshire and New York, okay? But New York didn't recognize this as an official sort of state move. Benning Wentworth was the longest serving colonial governor, so his grants were very real, and you can't really erase in time what he did because he bought and sold those grants, and people, had those fees and spent that money. But later, I guess I kind of lost it there for a second. Sorry about that.
Well, no, that's fine. Benning's the New Hampshire governor at the
Yes.
time?
Oh, okay. I remember right where I was. I'm sorry about
Yeah.
that. So by staking the claim for the whole group is what Breckenridge was doing. Okay. He was the one that the trials were aimed at. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So in 71, having lost in court and actually weirdly admitting that his farm was within 17 miles of Hudson River, a 300-person sheriff's posse from New York, including the mayor of Albany and the magistrates and the lawyers and all the various officials, accompanied by militia, came to do this eviction of Breakenridge, okay? And it's, I think the New Yorkers expected the civil action to happen. They expected to be resisted. They had been resisted in these attempts before, and they had arrested a couple of the Vermont leaders, and some of the Vermont leaders had spent time in jail in Albany. So I think they were pretty sure when they came right in the middle of the summer to evict Breckenridge, they would probably meet with some resistance. So that's why there's 300 of them. So it's called a posse comitatus. So they were stopped at a bridge, and there would have been a lot of negotiating at the bridge. Most specifically, the sheriff would have read the Vermonters or the New Hampshire grantees the Riot Act. So what that does is that tells them that they have an hour to disperse, or they're all basically felons and will be subject to arrest individually in the future. Okay, and at the same time, the Riot Act empowers the posse. So the men that he brought with him are now sort of deputized by the reading of the Riot Act. So the Riot Act is read. A small contingent of the group went from that bridge down to Breckenridge's house, which was about a half a mile away, and they tried to convince the Vermonters to accept the rulings in Albany court, which they didn't do. So then the result of that was that the small group went back to the posse comitatus at the bridge and could not convince any of them to go back down to Breckenridge's house and actually evict him. Okay, so what we have is sort of a failed, sort of aborted attempt where then only 30 of the 300 go down to Breckenridge's house, and when they get there, they find themselves in the middle of an ambush. So sort of the future Green Mountain Boys or the Bennington militia had created an ambush. There was a couple of ridges north and south of the Breckenridge home. They fortified the Breckenridge home, cut loopholes to cut through, to shoot out the windows, had a flag to raise up and down the chimney to communicate to the other guys, and dared the sheriff to break down the door with an axe. So that's the job of the sheriff, to take control of these properties, is to forcibly enter the property and to serve the papers. So there would have been a moment where the sheriff actually grabbed that axe and went towards the door. And so this is the birthplace of Vermont right here that I'm telling you about, is that the Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and their level muskets and the threats and their resolution stopped that sheriff from swinging that axe and breaking that door.
Wow.
So he would have been, concerned about his own safety. His posse would have been concerned about their own safety. So perhaps they were saying, hey, Sheriff 10X, you better stop. I think we're in danger here. And that's really what became, like I said, the birthplace of Vermont. It was, the phrase, I think, was coined by Highland Hall, who is the man behind he was a former Vermont governor and the man behind the design of the Bennington Battle Monument. And his really his favorite subject was this birthplace of Vermont, sort of Green Mountain Boys, New York, New Hampshire controversy.
So this is all very fascinating. I think that's really interesting. Again, the governor of New York at the time, was that William Tryon at this time, or had he not been involved with this at this point?
So William Tryon is named governor right about the time of the Breakenridge Standoff.
Okay.
So if you can read things forward from the Breakenridge Standoff, they, by the end of the year of 1771, with Tryon being the governor, and with the Green Mountain Boys certainly aware of what happened at Alamance, with the using the cannon against the settlers, killing a few in battle, and hanging and arresting some leaders. They're expecting the same thing that's going to happen in Vermont. So this really tempered Vermont. So in Bennington, they acquired 2 cannon and a mortar, and they set up an ambush, thinking that Governor Tryon and a posse was actually coming to Vermont at some certain point that year.
Wow.
So
yeah. No, I thought that was, I knew he moved up there, but it sounds very similar to Alamance in the sense that reading the Riot Act and yeah, this coastal elite being involved in a lot of these kind of Western expansion settlers. So yeah, I'm kind of getting seeing a lot of these similarities between these two things. I find it really interesting that the sheriff and the group comes. Why do you think that? I guess how many people were with Breckenridge, and why did so many of the posse refuse to go down to the actual house with the sheriff? I guess he said it was only about 30 of them, right, that went down there. Was that fear of something happening to them, or not wanting to inaugurate a civil war or something? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
yeah, so I guess first of all, the numbers are a little fuzzy. So perhaps 300 on the New York side and maybe 200 on the Vermont side.
Oh, wow.
I'm not sure what to say about the numbers there. But the militia and the New Yorkers, I think, were really convinced that they were they had the same feelings as the New Hampshire grant settlers, and to evict them was not within what they were willing to do that day. And so I think that on many levels, people were figuring out that day, how they felt.
Mm-hmm.
So the Green Mountain Boys, the Bennington settlers, they're figuring out that day that they don't want the New York's jurisdiction to come to their town, and the New York settlers, not the officials, they ended up really having the same sentiments that day.
Interesting. And after this standoff comes, the sheriff decides he's not gonna, knock down the door or evict these people. Do they just turn around and head back home? And is the matter settled, or is this going to be like a continuing, boiling point that just kind of continues on? I guess what's the resolution of this standoff happening and not evicting the Breckenridge and the others?
Awesome, that's a great question. So immediately after the attempt to evict Breckenridge, there's kind of a funny punchline there. Maybe something like from an old Western. So Breckenridge, Sheriff Tenek then asked his posse to go further into Bennington to evict this guy named Josiah Fuller. So that would have required them to march sort of immediately through the town of Bennington. What a lark that he would actually ask them to do this. So at that request is where his posse melts away. So what happens after this? This really is the last time. So that's the birthplace of Vermont. This is the last time that New York would send a mounted sheriff's posse to Vermont, with an asterisk. I think there was one more sort of very unknown small sheriff's posse the next year. Okay, so this is essentially the last. This is the Vermonters or the New Hampshire grantees defeating that ruling in court. So after this is what we kind of call the beach seal era. So the Vermonters sort of had the upper hand. Once again, possession is 9/10 of the law. So New York's really fighting an uphill battle to claim this land. And the king himself will sort of have the ruling that all lands need to be sort of surveyed so they can be available for sale. So that's another thing that's going to start weaving itself in here, is sort of a race to survey and claim the rest of the land that we now know as Vermont. And so that's going to include really the stories of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys using the beach sail or whipping some of these surveyors and burning down a few cabins here and there, but more likely burning down what you would call possession houses or possession huts, where you'd clear some land and sort of stake your claim by putting down the logs for a future cabin. So some of these sort of claim kind of places were overturned by the Green Mountain Boys between 71 and 75. Then of course, in 75, not directly related, but that's when Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys take Fort Ticonderoga. And New York had never sent redcoats to Vermont to enforce its claim. It had requested redcoats a couple of times, and they had not been sent, first by Haldimand and then secondly by Gage. Actually, I got that wrong. First request was to Gage, and the second one was to Haldimand for some troops to go to Vermont. So just keep in mind, these troops that would have potentially gone to Vermont would have been the garrison from Fort Ticonderoga. So sort of symbolically taking Ticonderoga in 75 ends the threat that any redcoats are going to come and enforce New York's sort of royal prerogative that they attained through the king to the lands that became Vermont.
Interesting. Now, just as a background on the Green Mountain Boys, is this, is there an official time when they start, or do they just kind of rise up in defense against these incursions on New York? And did they call themselves the Green Mountain Boys? And just a little background on who they were, how they viewed themselves, and I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, I'm here really talking about the birthplace of, Vermont and the birthplace of the Green Mountain Boys. People date the birth of the Green Mountain Boys sort of throughout 69 or 71 or maybe 72. So as far as I'm concerned, who cares when they're born or whatever. A lot of people talk about the birth of the Green Mountain Boys being a meeting after this Bennington settlers lost in court in Albany. There was a meeting at the Catamount Tavern in Bennington, which is really the home of the Green Mountain Boys, with this snarling catamount facing New York, okay, symbolizing their war with New York. So there was a meeting there, and the result of that meeting is that the pastor of the New Light Separatist Church in Bennington suggested taking all the farms of the settlers under town protection. So to me, that's something like extending church brotherhood to every last settler and every last person that's bought, pieces of land from his church members. They're all going to be taken care of as one. So that's really what goes on with the ejectment trials, is that they stood up for the individuals as a group. And to me, that's when the Bennington militia, which was actually formed in 1764, I think that's when they become the Green Mountain Boys, is when they made that group decision, sort of through the church, to just take care of all these grants as one.
At a tavern, nonetheless, too.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. And then as far as like some of the figures in this like Breakenridge, what happens to him? Does and the sheriff, do we know what happens to him? And do these guys end up going loyalist or patriot when the Revolutionary War breaks out? Do you know anything about some of these individuals that are involved in the standoff and kind of where they went off to?
So yeah, of course I know all about that. So kind of they went in some different directions. So I believe Sheriff Tenek is going to be a patriot. He's going to have his own militia. I don't want to say for sure, but there is a Tenek that had the Albany County militia at the Battle of Saratoga. So I believe that might be the same Tenek here. The judge in the case of the ejectment trials was very important in the Revolution. That's Robert Livingston, but he continued to be sort of tough on the Vermonters as well. Okay, so not all the New Yorkers who are still patriotic would still sort of continue their claims versus Vermont. Breckenridge himself. So this is kind of I don't want to get into a long story here, but this is probably part of the reason why the Breakenridge Standoff and the birthplace of Vermont is kind of a little known story. So Breckenridge is going to become a loyalist, okay? So he may have actually turned at the ejectment trials. Remember I said he admitted that his farm was within 17 miles of Hudson River, and that he was the guy who Benning Wentworth's claims were all based upon the fact that he was the guy that stood up to New York, and his trial was going to be the test case, how precedents work. So all the trials were going to be dependent on what happened in his trial. Okay. And it appears that he may have been bribed or taken a job with the New Yorkers. So ironically, a weird thing happens that he's sent to London in 73 to plead the Vermont settlers case. Nothing happened there. Wonder why. So then Breckenridge and some others gather horses for the British at Breckenridge's farm for the Battle of Bennington. So we have the documentation that he was employed as a spy 1 week before the Battle of Bennington for the British. Okay, so it would take a couple of years, but when Ethan Allen gets out of captivity and returns to Vermont in 1778, he names Breckenridge as one of his 17 wicked Tories, because he's going to root out these loyalists and these Tories in the Bennington area, which were actually pretty formidable. So it takes a couple of years, but Breckenridge is going to become a captain in the Queen's Loyal Rangers and do some missions in northern Vermont against the Vermonters. He will then make amends with the Bennington people, and he's buried in the Bennington Shaftesbury here in Bennington. So what a story of loyalties. The original, person who stands up to the New Yorkers, traitor at the Battle of Bennington, goes against Vermont interests in the Revolutionary War, but the way the times were, he was able to make amends with his friends and neighbors and return to Bennington.
Oh, wow. That's a fascinating story. Yeah, no idea of that all those different ins and outs. Really interesting. And now you call, we say the birthplace of Vermont. When do they start referring to themselves as their own independent Vermont? And Vermont itself doesn't become its own independent state right until after, or in the middle of the wars, when they are going to declare their independence from New Hampshire. I guess how does this factor into the eventual creation of the independent state of Vermont?
Well, this is that story. So this is how you're going to realize, what happened with New Hampshire and New York, and that it's going to lead towards a long-standing disagreement. So remember that the 13 colonies are all 13 royal colonies that were created by King George, okay? One of those King Georges. And Vermont was the 14th sort of entity. Well, there was actually West Florida, East Florida. There's quite a few colonies, all right? 20 or something, right? But, Vermont is really acting as another state in the Revolutionary War there. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So New York is preventing them from becoming a state. At this time, it'll be Governor George Clinton. It gets very complicated. In 78 and 79, Vermont, with the war having moved to the south, Vermonters were very prudent. So things like the loyalties in Vermont were starting to shift and change. We have this story of Benedict Arnold, okay? The war was getting weird and desperate at this time. So Vermont is a place where there's going to be prisoner exchanges, okay? Loyalists and things like that are traveling from essentially New York City up to Montreal through Vermont, okay? And Vermonters are assisting with this prisoner exchange. And keep in mind that there's several posts in today's Vermont along Lake Champlain that Britain never gave up, and that's going to end up being part of the War of 1812. So Vermont becoming its own state is actually pretty darn complicated, because it's sort of British territory on some level if we still have British forts within Vermont. So anyways, George Washington sort of had it with Vermont by 1780. So the thing that was called the Continental Storehouse, which was the object of the British raid at the Battle of Bennington, which was in Bennington, was a continental storehouse with supplies that were from George Washington, you might say. So in 1780, that's when George Washington took away the Continental Storehouse in Vermont.
Yeah, okay.
And that Vermont and Northern New York were really defenseless. They were begging for troops and protection in the north from certain British and Indian raids.
Mm-hmm. And were they referring to this place as Vermont at the time, or was it still like the New Hampshire grants? Or...
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I went over that. So it was started out as New Connecticut in 77, and then they changed the name to Vermont in 1777. So it is Vermont.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
So it's Vermont. And then what happens is we don't become a state until 1791. And I think maybe some of your people might be interested in sort of the way I interpret that. So if in 1791, Vermont had to pay $30,000 to New York to extinguish its claims, which came from royal prerogative through an act that was very similar to the Stamp Act that was trying to restrict the colonists. That to me, sort of the Revolutionary War doesn't end until 1791. If one of the, you might say, member states is paying war reparations to another state. In 1788, the Livingston family, posing as representing the state of New York, bought most of the Iroquois lands for $20,000. And imagine Vermont paying New York $30,000 3 years later. And the claims that they actually paid for were New York claims Vermont granting land over the New York claims. Vermont didn't have to pay to extinguish New Hampshire's claims to the land that would become Vermont. Only the claims that Vermont granted after New York had granted that land. And that ends up becoming the spine of the Green Mountains.
Yeah.
So the spine of the Green Mountains is worth 50% more than all of Iroquois.
Interesting. Well, that's great. Now today, the site of the actual standoff, what's there today? Is the house still there? Is it marked? What can visitors see if they wanted to go see where this happened?
Yep. So there was a standoff at the bridge. So today there's a covered bridge there. It would have been a mill bridge or a simpler bridge there next to a grist mill. So first there was kind of a stopping that posse at the bridge. Next to the bridge is the Henry House. That house would have been there in 1771. So you still have an original house to look at. Down the street is a marker for the Seth Warner House. Seth Warner is the number 1 or number 2 guy in the Green Mountain Boys with Ethan Allen. He was one of the defendants in the ejectment trials, but his case was decided by James Breakenridge, folding in court. So he is sort of little known as a defendant, but his marker for his house is right there, and it was put in 1927 by. It wasn't the DAR. I think it might have been the state of Massachusetts or Connecticut. So then when you continue on the road, you'll get to the Breakenridge House location. There's another stone marker there. That one was put in 1927 by the DAR. Just behind that marker, you can see the well from the Breakenridge House. So that's probably right where the Breakenridge House was. The house that's on that property now was built later by a Bennington College professor, but it's built right in that ridge. So there's 2 ridges that are very easy to sort of see that the Green Mountain Boys would have been within musket shot, but protected behind ridges at that standoff.
That's great. And yeah, this is 2021. It's the 250th anniversary. What kind of things do you have lined up going on up there for the 250th anniversary?
Awesome. Well, thanks for asking. So on July 18th at between 1 and 4 o'clock, we're going to have some tours and some short lectures and some demonstrations, and we're going to have reenactors there. So there's going to be a sit-down commemoration ceremony. We've invited some important people to come there. And then there'll be a tour that'll be guided by myself. So we'll walk that half a mile along the route of that sheriff's posse coming to evict Vermonters, and, I just have to say, to me, this is Vermont's Boston Tea Party. This is where we threw the tea in the sea, and we were not going to put up with this anymore. And this, like I said, this is people deciding, both beforehand, but also right there at that moment, where they stood. Mm-hmm. So, if you come that day, I think we have a couple of vendors. I think we have a distillery, and it's just going to be a fun day sort of in the park. It'll be somewhat relaxed, and there's one ceremony to get through.
That's great. Yeah, so people can continue the celebrations for independence on in a couple weeks up there at the site of the Breakenridge Standoff. That's great. Where can people go to find more information about the events, or and also now I think this is what you're planning to be the first of a series of events of pre-Revolutionary War history there in Vermont.
Yeah, we sure are. So we have the 1771 birth of Vermont on Facebook. I run a Facebook page called the Battle of Bennington Facebook. The Bennington Museum will carry information about this as well. And yeah, it's pretty exciting because there's quite a few other little events. They're really exciting to us Vermonters, concerning the Green Mountain Boys, and lots of stories. So it'd be nice to get to invite people to those various locations and to some of these events over the next few years, so they can really understand what happened back then.
Yeah, no, I definitely hope we, as we come up on these other anniversaries, we can have more of these talks and stuff like that. And I'm trying to go, hit as many 250th events as I can, as we start gearing up for the, throughout over the next 10 years or more of different events. So it's an exciting time to want to read more and learn more and visit the sites of where all this stuff happened. I will say, Bob, the Emerging Revolutionary War, a bunch of us took a trip up to New York and Vermont, New Hampshire back in a couple years ago, and we happened to be up at Bennington one Sunday morning when you were up there. And I think that the battlefield site up there at Bennington is a fantastic site to visit. Bob did a excellent overview of everything that happened there and all the stuff you can see up there. Tell us a little bit about Bennington State Battlefield and do you guys have anything planned coming up too? And maybe tell people a little bit more about that battlefield park too.
That's right. So I work at the Bennington Battlefield, 4 days a week, kind of a little part-time docent up there. So you have someone to talk to when you come to the Bennington Battlefield. And that's new. There hasn't been anybody up there before. So we actually have a bunch of new interpretive panels. And the Bennington Battlefield now includes panels in more than just the one location. So the battlefield has just been Hessian Hill, where the Brunswick Dragoon Cavalry unit was posted, and they'd hoped to get their horses in Bennington, and they were defeated, and they rushed down the hill, and there was a one-sided sword fight. And those are the stories of our battle. But there's a few more places on the battlefield that you can go to, and there's some road signs that are yet to be installed. But anytime we sort of have a driving tour. So not unlike the Battle of Saratoga, we now have a driving tour of several locations and the corresponding kind of information.
Yeah, no, I thought it was, it was fantastic because it was great that, you were up there that day, because typically I think we think of, the battlefield park as just this one section on top of a hill, but, looking at the historic maps and being able to drive around and see all the different parts of that battlefield that I'm sure many people, might drive past and not realize they're on the actual battlefield. So I think it's great.
I forgot to mention the cannon. So we have a brand new replica operable 3-pounder cannon at the battlefield now that was donated by a descendant of one of the German soldiers who fought in the Battle of Bennington. So
oh, wow. Okay.
It's a pretty big upgrade to have a cannon up there now.
No, that's awesome. Definitely recommend everybody check out Bennington Battlefield Park. And I think it's interesting too, because I think it's remembered often as a Vermont battle, because the monument is over in Vermont, but the actual battlefield is over just across in New York. Is that correct?
That's right. So the Bennington was the object of the raid, and the British didn't bring enough men, so we cut them off. They sent for some reinforcements. The battle happened 2 days later. So ironically, the group sent to attack Bennington is on defense, and they're being attacked. And, just keep in mind that we kept them outside of the state and outside of the town, because the objective was to loot the mills for all the flour and grains and the farms for the horses, the cattle, and the oxen. So they were cut off at the pass and kept right out of the state.
Yep, they're successful in keeping them out of the state. And so like I said, and Bob's a fantastic tour guide. He does a great job of showing you all these really neat, interesting details. So if you are in the area, if you get a chance, go up and check out that Breakenridge Standoff event in a couple weeks. I highly recommend it. Has much been written about these events and this time period? Is there, I guess I'm asking, is there a good book that you could recommend people they wanted to be able to read more about the birth of Vermont and some of these events? Oh, looks like he's has it right on hand.
This is a newer book that was put out by the Vermont Historical Society, and it has a lot with the documents from the ejectment trials. So they kind of went right into some of the details there. Okay. So this is nice and brand new. I guess really the general story that the answer that I would give you is that it could be studied a little bit more. So if there's more people that wanted to get interested in the birthplace of Vermont and lend their take to this interesting history, I think we could all use sort of all the different takes out there that we could possibly get. So
Yeah, no, having, I've been, really interested in Revolutionary War for a long time, but until your event that you started planning, this is the first I've heard of it, first I've read into it. So I really appreciate you, yeah, heading up a lot of this research and creating this event and everything else like that. I think that that's going to do great things to get people interested and excited to learn more about, yeah, what, like I said, building up to the American Revolution, it's often viewed as just a straight American versus British kind of engagement, but you really have all these different kind of variables going on. You have these different backgrounds of these people and these conflicts, intercolonial conflicts going on, just as we're getting ready to declare independence. So I think that's I think it's fascinating, and yeah, it's great to learn all these new stories. So appreciate everything you're doing up there in Vermont to keep our Revolutionary War heritage going strong. So
Thank you. Thank you.
all right, well, yeah, we'll go ahead and end this this week's edition of the Rev War Revelry. I want to thank Bob for joining us. If anybody hasn't checked out Emerging Revolutionary War, we are actually doing our own tour of the battles of Trenton and Princeton this November, doing a bus tour of those battlefields. Hopefully the beginning of what will be of us being able to offer tours at different battlefields across the country. And so if you're interested in that, definitely check out the blog at emergingrevolutionarywar.org. But thank you, Bob, for joining us. Hope everybody had a wonderful holiday weekend. And we'll see you next week. Next weekend, we're doing a Rev War Revelry, talking about still staying up in the Northeast, but heading down that Hudson River. We're going to be talking about Fort Washington and Fort Lee in the battles that happened there back in 1776. But thank you, Bob, for joining us, and we'll see you all in the future.